What if the collapse didn't come with sirens, but with silence? Canada is quietly walking away from American dining, and no one's sounding the alarm. In just the last 24 months, over 1,000 American restaurant locations have vanished across the border. Applebees, once the face of casual comfort, is disappearing town by town. Red Lobster shuttered across more than 120 neighborhoods. Duncan, over 500 stores were erased. This isn't a dip in business, but a whole cultural rejection. A retreat from greasy menus, corporate slogans, and the very symbols of American food identity. And if Canada, our next-door neighbor, our closest trading partner, is saying no more, what happens next? Are we watching the slow death of the chains we grew up with? Or is this the beginning of something far more painful? A moment where America's most familiar brands become relics in a world that's moving on without us. This is the Downturn Report, where the truth gets personal. And today, we expose the 10 famous American restaurant chains that are falling in Canada. Number 1, Olive Garden. Once a staple of suburban comfort, Olive Garden stood as a beacon of Italian-American indulgence that didn't break the bank. It was the backdrop of family birthdays, milestone anniversaries, and those simple Friday nights where you didn't feel like cooking, with warm lighting, faux Tuscan decor, and the promise of unlimited breadsticks. The restaurant symbolized more than just a meal. It offered a taste of celebration for working class and middle-income families across North America. At its height, Olive Garden operated more than 850 locations. And for a time, that included a steady stream of Canadian visitors who made crossing the border part of their dinner plans. But today, that tide has turned, and Olive Garden, once a destination, now finds itself deserted, one empty booth at a time. Between the years 2015 and 2019, internal company data revealed that in U.S. border states like Michigan, Vermont, and New York, as many as 1 out of every 4 weekend customers came from Canada. Why? It was a familiar environment, with dependable food and no tipping confusion. But by the summer of 2024, that steady Canadian customer base began to evaporate. It started with rising gas prices and a weak Canadian dollar. But the real damage came with a scandal that many say shattered public trust. In early 2023, reports surfaced that Gene Lee, the former CEO of Darden Restaurants, received over $11 million in stock compensation, even as thousands of Olive Garden's part-time staff were being laid off. Canadians reacted with fury. Online platforms like Reddit Canada and Twitter were set ablaze with anger. The hashtag #DropDarden exploded overnight. Post after post criticized the chain's leadership, its corporate greed, and its declining food quality. For many, that was enough. Canadians simply stopped showing up. The fallout hit small-town America hard. Olive Garden closures meant lost jobs for students, single mothers, and retirees. For seniors relying on tip-based income, the sudden lack of customers was devastating. Some towns lost their only mid-range dining option. Meanwhile, Canadian chains like Eastside Mario's and Moxie's, with fresher menus and prices up to 25% lower, quickly filled the vacuum. As one Canadian Reddit user said plainly, "Why waste gas on stale ravioli when I can walk down the street for something better and cheaper now?" Darden warns that up to 80 more Olive Garden locations in the United States could shut their doors before the end of 2025. And if the quiet Canadian boycott spreads to countries like the United Kingdom or Australia, the brand's global footprint may not survive beyond 2026. What's slipping away isn't just a restaurant chain, it's a piece of American tradition that is fading and few even noticed it leaving. Number 2, Starbucks. No one held up signs. No one shouted in protest. But if you walk past certain corners in Vancouver or Buffalo today, you'll see what's missing. Starbucks, the once unstoppable giant. The modern-day town square of both Canada and the United States is quietly disappearing. The chairs are still there, the signs are still up, but the people are gone. And what's left behind is far more haunting than an angry boycott. It's silence. Since the year 2020, more than 400 Starbucks stores across North America have closed their doors. In Canada alone, 144 locations vanished in just the year 2023. Cities along the border, where American and Canadian cultures once mingled freely, were hit the hardest. These weren't just places to grab coffee, they were morning routines, study spots, quiet places for retirees to read the paper, and neutral ground for casual meetups. But that familiar hum of espresso machines and gentle jazz, It's been replaced with the stillness of empty tables and unplugged speakers. The shift didn't happen all at once. For Canada's younger generation, especially, Gen Z priorities changed. Local, eco-conscious indie cafes now offer sustainable options, personalized service, and authenticity that a multinational chain can't match. Meanwhile, the weakening Canadian dollar and soaring gas prices have kept people closer to home. For many Americans living near the border, the cost of living crisis has drawn a stark line between necessity and indulgence. A $6 latte feels like an extravagance when prescription meds, rent, and food all compete for the same dwindling paycheck. The siren on that iconic white cup used to represent more than caffeine. It was community, comfort, and routine. Today, it's a reminder of what's been lost. Office workers now brew at home. Seniors glance at the chalkboard menus, shake their heads, and keep walking, even in prime downtown areas. Cafes that once bustled with laptops and conversation now echo with vacancy. One well-known location on Robson Street in Vancouver sits dark and shuttered, its windows reflecting the lives that no longer pass through. The most unsettling part isn't that Starbucks is failing in Canada. It's that no one seems to care. There's no outrage, no drama, just quiet indifference, like a once close friend you no longer call. Starbucks wasn't just American, it was a shared experience between neighbors. Its slow disappearance reveals something deeper than declining profits. It marks a growing emotional distance, not born of anger, but from quiet separation. And perhaps what we've lost isn't just the coffee, but the feeling that we were still, in some way, connected. Number 3, Applebees. It's hard to believe that a country with an economy just 1/10 the size of the United States could quietly deal a devastating blow to one of America's most iconic restaurant chains. But that's exactly what Canada is doing without shouting, without protest signs, and without headlines. Instead, the rejection of Applebees is happening in silence. And for a company built on routine and comfort, this kind of silence is perhaps the most dangerous sound of all. For many working-class American families from the late 1990s through the early 2000s, Applebee's was much more than a chain restaurant. It was a second home, a familiar spot where birthdays were celebrated, sports wins toasted, and after-school meals shared over chicken tenders and 2-for-1 appetizers. It was the affordable alternative to fancier restaurants, a place where a family of 4 could still have a full dinner for under $40 at its peak. Applebee's operated more than 2,000 locations across the country, embedding itself in the rhythms of American life from rural back roads to bustling suburbs. But Applebee's wasn't only a part of American tradition, it was also a fixture for Canadian visitors. Each weekend, thousands of Canadians crossed the border for a day of bargain shopping and casual dining. They'd load up at Walmart, browse through outlet malls, and end the trip with a comforting sit-down meal at Applebee's. In states like New York, Michigan, and Washington, Canadian customers made up as much as 30% of weekend sales, according to a 2018 Technomic report. That steady traffic was more than helpful, it was essential. It paid the bills, kept staff employed, and gave small-town locations the breathing room they needed to survive. But by the end of 2024, the tide had fully turned. Applebee's had shrunk to just 1,586 U.S. locations, more than 400 fewer than a decade earlier. And it's not just an accident. In early 2025, leaked internal forecasts revealed that many more locations, especially those near the border, are on track to shutter before year's end. The reason Canadian traffic has collapsed. Some of that is economics, a weaker Canadian dollar, high gas prices, and pandemic-era travel habits that never quite recovered. But the bigger blow came in 2022, when a leaked internal email from an Applebee's executive surfaced. In that message, the executive stated that inflation could actually benefit the company because it would force desperate people to accept lower-wage jobs. That cold calculation sparked immediate backlash in Canada, a country that holds workers' rights and fairness in high regard. Canadians didn't boycott with picket signs, they just quietly stopped showing up. And in doing so, they sparked one of the quietest, most painful collapses of an American restaurant brand in recent memory. In small towns where Applebee's was the only sit-down choice, doors have closed without warning. Longtime servers, some with over 2 decades of service, were let go overnight. Elderly couples who once enjoyed Sunday lunches together now face long drives or microwaved meals. Parents working multiple jobs have lost a simple, familiar place to share time with their children. Meanwhile, Canadian chains like Swiss Chalet and Boston Pizza have stepped in to fill the void. They didn't make noise about it. They just showed up with steady prices, reliable food, and a reputation untarnished by scandal. Applebees, on the other hand, now feels like something old and out of touch, a brand that forgot who it was serving. Canadians didn't plan to abandon Applebees, but when enough people quietly choose something else, the result is the same. So the question remains, what do we do when a beloved place slips away? Not with a bang, but with a whisper. That's not just the loss of a restaurant, that's the end of a bond. And if you think this is the saddest part of the story, just wait. Number 4, IHOP. IHOP was once more than just a breakfast stop. It was part of the American weekend ritual, a place where eggs sizzled, coffee poured endlessly, and pancakes stacked high brought comfort without pretense. For more than 60 years, it represented a slower, kinder kind of dining. Whether it was a tired truck driver grabbing a late-night plate or a family gathering after Sunday church, the blue-roofed restaurant stood for something deeply familiar, something American, something warm. And for Canadians crossing the border, IHOP was often the first and most welcoming stop, a stack of pancakes with a side of nostalgia. At its peak, IHOP operated over 1,600 locations across the United States, many positioned strategically near the Canadian border: Minnesota, New Hampshire, North Dakota. These states thrived on weekend visits from Canadian families eager for a taste of classic American breakfast. But that rhythm has broken. Since the year 2022, a quiet, unsettling pattern has emerged. IHOPs near the border are closing, one after another. No loud protests, no newsworthy scandals, just locked doors, empty booths, and goodbye signs no one saw coming. The numbers paint a stark picture. More than 60 IHOP locations have disappeared from northern states since the start of 2022. Dine Brands, IHOP's parent company, is already warning that up to 100 more closures may come before the end of 2026. But this isn't simply a case of corporate downsizing, it's a signal, a sign that something deeper is shifting. Canadians, once loyal patrons of IHOP, have quietly stopped showing up. And the reasons are hard to ignore. Between 2021 and 2023, the price of eggs in the United States jumped by more than 50%. A breakfast that once cost under $8 now runs closer to $15 even before tax and tip. At the same time, the Canadian dollar has weakened, gas prices have soared, and lingering border restrictions have made even a casual weekend trip more burdensome than it's worth. That familiar pancake breakfast, once a sweet indulgence, now feels like a financial stretch. But the damage isn't just economic, it's emotional. Over the past year, social media platforms like Reddit and TikTok have lit up with Canadian voices sharing their disappointment. Watery coffee, overcooked eggs, sticky tables, servers who seem stressed, undertrained, or simply overwhelmed. The warm, friendly vibe that once defined IHOP has been replaced in the minds of many Canadians by images of rundown locations and lackluster meals. And when they compare that to Canadian chains like Cora or Eggsmart places offering better service, cleaner dining rooms, and more competitive prices, the choice becomes easy. Why drive for hours and spend more for less? And then there are the people behind the counter, the quiet victims of this shift. Many IHOP workers are part-time staff juggling multiple jobs, students paying their tuition, or older adults supplementing fixed incomes. In small towns where IHOP was one of the few local employers, sudden closures hit hard, no severance packages, no reassignment, just a shuttered building and livelihoods erased overnight. This isn't just a story about breakfast fading. It's about the slow erosion of something familiar, something many of us took for granted. IHOP, once a cross-border comfort, now finds itself drifting into irrelevance, one closed location at a time. And in Canada, the morning meal still thrives, it's just happening elsewhere. So now the question stands, is IHOP simply too expensive for today's reality? Or has it lost the very soul that once made it special? Number 5, KFC. What do you do when something as simple and comforting as a bucket of fried chicken, once the symbol of weekend family meals, roadside pit stops, and Friday night indulgence, suddenly becomes something you can no longer trust for generations? KFC wasn't just about food, it was about familiarity. That red and white bucket wasn't just filled with crispy drumsticks and golden biscuits, it carried memories. A hot meal you didn't have to cook. A reward at the end of a long week. A gesture of love when time or money was tight. But today, in Canada, that comfort has turned cold, and the silence around it says more than any headline ever could. The moment everything shifted came in the year 2023, when a Consumer Reports investigation exposed something deeply unsettling. Several fast food chicken samples tested positive for trace levels of industrial chemicals. And among the worst offenders were pieces from KFC. The revelation didn't just live on newsprint, it caught fire across the very platforms younger Canadians use to share, warn, and react. TikTok exploded with hashtags. Reddit lit up with outraged threads. YouTube creators dissected the findings. And suddenly, a fried chicken brand once seen as harmless, even nostalgic, became a symbol of corporate carelessness. But what followed wasn't outrage. It was rejection, a quiet, decisive turning away. Because for many Canadian families, especially younger generations, this wasn't just about one bad report. It was about a growing sense that KFC no longer reflected their values. While Canada has leaned into transparency, hormone-free meat, and plant-based innovation, KFC seemed stuck in the past, where A&W offered grass-fed beef and Beyond Burgers. KFC clung to its legacy formula: cheaper ingredients, nostalgia-driven marketing, and an industrial supply chain that had begun to feel disconnected from modern life. The numbers speak for themselves. KFC once had over 700 restaurants in Canada, but since the report, dozens have shuttered. Some disappeared overnight, lights out, buckets gone, signs stripped from the walls, no farewell, no explanation. And for the workers inside, many of whom relied on the paycheck just to survive, it was another corporate decision made far above their heads. Meanwhile, Canadian consumers have shifted their loyalties. They didn't organize protests. They just stopped coming. They found better tasting, cleaner, more transparent alternatives, and they didn't look back. And now, what used to be a dependable weekend meal is increasingly out of reach. Not just in Canada, but in parts of the US too. Combo meals that once cost $7 or $8 now reach $12 or $13. For many working-class families, a single KFC meal no longer feeds the whole table. It barely covers one plate. And with grocery prices spiking and fresh food harder to afford, just cooking at home is not the easy fix it sounds like. That's why Canada's silent boycott hurts more than it seems. It isn't just about fried chicken. It's about the slow, painful loss of something millions once trusted. Something that brought comfort during uncertainty. Something that stood for reliability, for warmth, for one less thing to worry about. And now it's fading without a sound. If you've ever brought home that familiar bucket and heard the crinkle of waxed paper, if you've ever passed a biscuit to a grandchild or shared a laugh over greasy napkins and spicy wings, hold on to that memory. Because across the border, that moment no longer exists. And what Canada is teaching us quietly, but unmistakably, is this: when trust is gone, no bucket can bring it back. Number 6, Duncan. What happens when even the smallest joys like your regular morning coffee quietly slip away when a cup you once counted on, at a price you could afford, simply vanishes without warning? That's the quiet heartbreak unfolding across towns near the US-Canada border. And the chain behind it isn't some struggling newcomer. It's Duncan, once the heartbeat of the early American morning. For decades, Duncan was more than a coffee shop. It was a routine, a rhythm, a piece of daily life. You didn't need a reservation or a credit card with points. All you needed was $2 and a few spare minutes, a warm cup of coffee, a simple donut, and maybe a seat by the window. Truck drivers stopped in before the sun rose. Teachers grabbed a cup on the way to school. Retirees sat and read the paper. It was affordable, reliable, and deeply local. And for many Canadians crossing the border, especially from nearby towns in Quebec or Ontario, Duncan felt like a charming little ritual, one they made time for. But between the years 2022 and 2024, that gentle flow of cross-border traffic came to a halt. According to internal industry data, Duncan locations near the US-Canada border saw foot traffic decline by up to 25%. And in some towns, particularly in Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York, that drop hit like a slow creeping tide. Canadians stopped coming. No headlines, no outrage, just fewer cars in the lot. fewer voices at the counter, and eventually, fewer employees behind it. Why did they disappear? The reasons, like the goodbye itself, were quiet but undeniable. Gas prices in Canada surged, the exchange rate weakened, and a generational shift began to emerge. Younger Canadians, especially Gen Z, turned to boutique coffee shops, local roasters, and independent cafes offering oat milk lattes and artfully foamed cappuccinos. Duncan, known for its quick and cheap model, failed to pivot, and as tastes evolved, the brand that once thrived on simplicity suddenly felt outdated in rural American towns. The ripple effect has been brutal. Many of these locations relied heavily on both Canadian foot traffic and a base of local workers. When business dropped, hours were cut. Workers, many of them older adults or recent immigrants, found themselves pushed out with little notice. Some shops closed overnight, bricked up and abandoned. One such closure in Vermont came without warning. No farewell sign, just silence, where laughter and conversation once echoed. There's now just an empty space where a window used to be. This wasn't a public scandal or an economic earthquake. It was something quieter, a slow erosion. And in that quiet, something deeply human has been lost. Because for many communities, Duncan wasn't just a business. It was where the day began. It was the smile you got before your shift, the coffee you shared with a friend you hadn't seen in a while, the place you ran to when you were running late but still needed 5 minutes to breathe. Now, as the closures continue and the booths stay empty, we're forced to ask what happens when a small part of our morning routine disappears. Do we just move on? Or do we quietly grieve the loss of something that once grounded us across the Canadian border? That goodbye has already been said, and maybe we didn't notice until it was already too late. Number 7. Subway. For more than 20 years, Subway positioned itself as the smarter, healthier alternative in fast food. It wasn't just a sandwich, it was a message that you cared, that you were choosing better. A 6-inch sub instead of a greasy burger, lettuce instead of fries. It felt lighter, cleaner, somehow more responsible. And for a long time, both Americans and Canadians bought into that promise. But between the years 2020 and 2024, that image began to quietly crumble. Over 1,000 Subway locations closed across North America, with a sharp collapse in Canadian provinces like Quebec and British Columbia. The most haunting part: there was no major scandal, no headlines, no sudden wave of protests, just a slow unraveling of trust. Questions started to spread. Was the bread really fresh? Were the vegetables truly clean? Did eat fresh mean anything anymore? Or was it just another hollow slogan, while Subway stood still, clinging to old branding and outdated ingredients? Canadian consumers quietly pivoted. They turned to places like Freshii, offering local produce and transparent sourcing, or to Tim Hortons, where familiarity met national pride, and without a fight, Canada walked away. Now, the damage is no longer abstract. It's deeply personal. In small American towns, Subway wasn't just another fast food option, it was often the only place someone could grab a fresh, decent meal on a budget. Retirees, teachers, shift workers, people who needed something quick but didn't want deep-fried regret relied on it. Now, many are greeted with dark windows and for lease signs, and for the elderly, especially those living alone, that missing lunch stop feels like one more connection quietly disappearing. One small shopping plaza in Vermont says it all. The sign is still there, but the lights are out. The chairs are stacked. There's no graffiti, no damage, just silence. Like the end of a chapter that no one knew had already finished. When even a humble sandwich shop loses our trust, it forces a deeper question. What else are we letting slip away without a sound? And when did the everyday things like lunch start to feel so fragile? Number 8. Burger King. Burger King once symbolized working-class freedom. Have it your way was more than a slogan, it was a promise. But by the year 2023, that promise collapsed. Over 400 American stores shuttered, and in Canada, the chain slipped out of malls across Ontario and Alberta with barely a whisper. In their place, A&W and Harvey's brands that spoke to changing values: cleaner food, local roots, modern convenience. Canadian traffic dried up as gas prices soared and cultural ties frayed. Younger consumers wanted transparency, apps, customization. Burger King offered none. While competitors evolved, the King stood still. Nostalgia couldn't save it. The loss hits hardest in places people forget. Seniors still clipping coupons, Overnight workers hoping for one warm meal. Small towns where Burger King was the only place lit after 9. One Kansas location still bears the crown above its door, but walk inside, and it's cold. The fryer's off, the booths are dusty, the symbol remains, but the soul is gone. And maybe that's the deeper loss, not just burgers, but the quiet dignity of a place where people once felt included. When even the Whopper vanishes, who's left to say we still matter? Number 9. Buffalo Wild Wings. Buffalo Wild Wings once brought game day to life. With over 1,200 locations, it filled weekends with noise, cheers, and overflowing baskets of wings. In border towns like Buffalo and Detroit, Canadians crossed over just for the thrill. Super Bowl seats were booked days in advance. Beer, wings, and a sense of belonging made it more than a restaurant. It was a ritual, but from 2021 to 2024, that energy collapsed. Over 100 locations closed, even in longtime strongholds. Inspire Brand's own 2023 report showed border locations down 11%. Canadian foot traffic dropped 35%. Blame inflation. Wings once under $1 now top $1.79 each. Beer costs soared post-pandemic. And Canadian chains like Boston Pizza and the Canadian Brew House offered the same big screens and cold pints without the border hassle. Then came scandal. A 2023 viral TikTok showed Ohio staff ignoring Asian customers. The video outraged many, especially in Canada's multicultural communities. Health complaints soon followed. Today, the TVs still glow, but the roar is gone. Workers lost tips, fans lost a home, and in both countries, game night feels just a little more empty. Number 10, McDonald's. What if McDonald's didn't fall with a bang but with a whisper? In 2024, sales in Quebec fell 19%, with Ontario close behind. Canada, once a steady friend, has turned away quietly. Once, the Golden Arches meant more than burgers. They meant family road trips, after-school fries, and late-night stops on snowy highways. But now, in border towns, McDonald's feels empty. The signs still glow, but the warmth is gone. Why the retreat? It's more than inflation or a weak Canadian dollar. Grocery bills, gas prices, and post-COVID spending caution all play a role. But culture is shifting. Canadian Gen Z, fueled by movements like Stop Eating Ultra-Processed Food, now sees McDonald's not as comfort, but as compromise. The rejection isn't angry, it's quiet, and that makes it harder to stop. For Americans near the border, the loss stings. Fewer Canadian visitors mean fewer sales. Local McDonald's close. For students, seniors, and working families, that means fewer jobs, fewer safe hangouts, fewer hot breakfasts that don't break the bank. If McDonald's, a place once trusted by millions, is being left behind, we have to ask, what else are we losing while no one's watching if other countries do the same? What's left for the towns built around these familiar signs? What happens when the last booth goes empty and the last affordable cup of coffee disappears? This isn't just economic decline, it's cultural erosion, the unraveling of the small, ordinary joys that held our days together. And now we ask ourselves, was this collapse sudden, or did it begin with the first quiet goodbye we chose not to notice?